Good morning, everyone. I'm Haris Salibasic. I'm an associate professor from the University of West Florida. I teach strategic management, political economy, and ethics courses. And my primary research interests are in resilience and sustainability. Today, I'm going to talk about research I've been working on for the last 3 years. It really touches on the issue of supportive and positive engagement of public in different policy options to diffuse negative governance, to support renewable energy projects. And my focus is on the United States. The reason being is that I have been following numerous projects, over 220 projects that have been denied, canceled, in postponement. They have received very negative attention from concerned citizens, some valid, some reasonable, and some unreasonable, some not so valid, mostly solar, but also wind projects as well. What's surprising is that there's a lot of opposition to solar projects in the United States. Some of that is organized by different groups, and some of them are outside the local communities as well. My presentation is really going through 5 different areas. One is introduction, then theoretical framework, methodology, results, and discussions. And I have some policy recommendations as well after I make my concluding remarks. So the idea that I'm introducing here is the topic or issue of hyper-engaged citizenry that often leads to negative governance. And such hyper-engaged citizenry or public engagement that's hyper-engaged in nature has adverse effects on policy decisions, which leads to negative governance. Negative governance can be defined as governance that is devoid of policy implementations, policy decision-making processes that are beneficial to the majority of population. One of the challenges of renewable energy goals in the United States at local, state, and national government is the complex energy transition processes and lack of national framework. As you know, in the United States, it's a very fragmented policy network as well as energy network, and leads to a lot of decision-making at local and regional levels. And it also leaves a lot of potential negative effects on of the future of renewable energy, which then defines and potentially reacts to negative connotations that often come around with the negative engagement from the residents or from the public. My research contributions in this sense are reacting to the scholarship on the practical applicability of collaborative governance. I'm looking at collaborative governance as a potential framework and lens to view this project, and reorganizes around the framework understanding of the threats to the future of sustainable energy projects being mainly renewable energy in this case. And then I also provide recommendations for academia, policymakers, and the general public on how to deal with negative perception, negative governance, and hyper-engaged citizenry. Collaborative governance can be defined as a governance that provides for engagement of the wider public for the betterment of society or for the betterment of communities. And building on that collaborative governance principles, I propose the concept of negative governance and hyper-engaged citizenry to understand the public opposition to the renewables. The case study really involves purposefully selected 50 renewable energy projects in the United States. There are many more, but I started working on that and I realized the enormity of the project. So I started using reports, public hearing notices, information from the companies that submitted their plans for renewable energy projects, and analyzing those reports and articles and government documents for the past 5 years. I used the NVivo software-aided 2-cycle coding to analyze these reports. And this is just a sample of these different projects that were either denied, delayed. There are some that have been approved, for example, in Pima County, Tucson, Clinton County in Iowa, and things like that. There are projects that have been approved, but they have undergone significant delays or opposition, and obviously that leads to significant loss of potential revenues and potential cancellation of the projects. My discussions and results revolve around public engagement, renewable energy, local government, or media, and state-owned government, and looks at different themes and categories that I was able to glean from using the two-cycle coding on opposition and planning methods, and looking at the policy and rulemaking that define renewable energy projects at various levels of government. In researching this and what I came up with, and my paper is currently under review in one of the major energy research papers, policy energy. The concluding remarks I have from that paper is that hyper-engaged citizenry, often combined with semi-formal or formal groups, they use misinformation and hostile campaigns against the solar and wind projects, and create significant impediments to resilience, create active barriers, and serve rather than being catalysts to sustainable energy projects. Oftentimes local government officials or officials at any level of government react negatively, and instead of leading, they retreat and create negative governance, in a sense, devoid of policy making that benefits wider public. And such retreat from negative governance is really necessity to move forward renewable energy projects. As I said, there are hundreds of projects being delayed, and they are absolutely critical for future of resilience of this country, and local governments are playing a huge role in meeting those renewable energy goals and targets. Elected officials really they retreat and start to be less of a catalyst, but oftentimes what they do is what they don't do is they should do it, though, is to start early planning and seek pre-approvals and recognize potential oppositions, and engaging a wider public rather than listening to local oppositions who often do not represent majority of population. And I have to preface that there are, of course, those who have valid, legitimate concerns over renewable energy projects in their communities. And officials should engage the entire population, seek input from those impacted before and during the project planning and development. We often see that sometimes, perhaps in some cases, we've seen a lack of engagement on both parts, about part of the public officials, but also developers who are bringing renewable energy projects forward. My contact information is here. I write a lot on renewable energy, sustainable energy, but my focus really in the context of sustainability and resilience planning, strategic resilience and sustainability planning, to promote future resiliency of our communities and states. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions after my colleagues present, and big hello from Florida. It's raining today.
Brilliant. So should we jump right in with sharing the screen now? Just give me a second here. Great. I hope it's coming up now. Can you see my screen? Oh, fantastic. Yeah, sorry
Yes,
for
we
that
can.
delay, struggling a bit with Zoom as per usual. But
It's
yeah,
okay.
great. Thank you very much for the opportunity of speaking here. I really appreciate it. Me and Johannes are going to speak about energy policy responses to cryptocurrency mining, which I think is quite a hot topic these days, given everything we've seen around cryptocurrency exchanges as well in the past month. My name is Moritz Platt. I'm a doctoral researcher at King's College, where I look into identity-based consensus protocols. And I'm also employed as a customer engineer by a multinational technology company. But today I'm not speaking on behalf of that company, but strictly in the context of the research work with King's College London. And with me is my dear colleague, Johannes.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Johannes Sedlmeier. I'm a research associate at the University of Luxembourg at the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability, and Trust. And my research background is on challenges of using blockchain in organizations and also digital identity management on smartphones. And so we split this presentation in two parts. The first half, I will present some background knowledge on blockchain technology and why some cryptocurrencies consume enormous amounts of electricity. And then in the second part, Moritz will continue by presenting a study with users, how their perception of energy consumption was and what we can learn, how we could mitigate the energy consumption of cryptocurrencies. So talk about measures that are more and measures that are less useful to address the issue. Right. So the energy consumption of cryptocurrencies and crypto assets is pretty controversial. So in the news, I see that every couple of weeks that, for example, there was a new measurement, how much energy is consumed by Bitcoin, that non-fungible tokens, so these funny pictures of bored apes, for example, are associated with enormous amounts of electricity consumption. In 2018, there was an interesting study that occurred in Nature Climate Change, so one of the most renowned journals that we have, and it claimed that Bitcoin alone could be the reason why we observe 2 degrees Celsius of global warming within a decade. And hopefully, the part of the presentation that I'm giving will also illustrate to you why this claim is wrong, but why nevertheless Bitcoin consumes a lot of electricity. So typically it is compared to the electricity consumption of a medium-sized industrial country, like, for example, Norway. So cryptocurrencies are based on blockchain technology, and you can consider blockchain technology as some kind of a virtual server or virtual computer that is available for everyone on Earth. So basically any participant, if they like, can maintain a copy of a database that represents the blockchain, and every transaction, for example, of financial type, but it could also be some associated with a process in cross-organizational workflows, will be stored on each user's individual edge device, be it a computer, a laptop, or a mobile phone. And so you can consider it as somewhat a programmable cloud, so you can deposit data there, you can execute programs, they are called smart contracts. It is characterized by extremely high availability because there are so many copies and one of them is always running. But the very difference to basically enterprise alternatives to this paradigm, because you could say, for example, that AWS also gives you high availability because it has 3 zones redundancy. There is also somewhat enforceable logic when it comes to access management. But the very difference with blockchain is that it is non-proprietary. So basically, there is no dedicated owner of the blockchain, but it is run by the collective. So in cooperation among all the participants who run the synchronized copies on their computers. So this already tells you a lot of disadvantages that blockchains have, because, for example, if every copy of the blockchain is doing the same thing, then the system is always bounded by the slowest computer that is takes part. So essentially, if you want to give everyone the opportunity to participate, you cannot make the demands on computational capacity and storage capacity of the individual participants too high. It's also expensive because you need to run the same operation not only on one computer or one computer and 3 backup copies, but on potentially thousands or tens of thousands of copies distributed all over the world. And it also means that intrinsically there is no privacy if you're using blockchain, because everybody is doing the same computations on their device, and so everybody can see what all the others are doing right now. The most important characteristic of blockchain, besides this replicated execution and storage of transactions, is that there is a so-called consensus mechanism. And all these blockchains typically involve some proof of X consensus mechanism. What is consensus mechanism? So if we have synchronized copies of a blockchain, then all the participants somehow need to agree on the next modifications of the database that will happen. So to keep synchronized, we need agreement what should be the next step. And if this synchronization should not be dependent on a dedicated third party, we need somewhat decentralized agreement. Now, one form of decentralized agreement that we all know and that is also working quite well is election-based. So if we know the individuals that are participating in the system, we can use some voting-based consensus mechanism where the majority decides what should happen in the next step. We can also use something like repeated random choice, so throwing a dice basically and choosing randomly one of the participants. This works well in a closed environment in which everybody knows who is participating. But typically, if we look at cryptocurrencies, they are designed to be open or permissionless, which means they should give everyone the opportunity to participate without any entry barriers, an institution that decides who may participate. And so we cannot really apply a voting-based consensus mechanism because this would involve some rat race of registering new accounts, because anyone could just open so many accounts that they can have the majority vote. So this is not useful, and so we need some way to couple a scarce resource that you cannot just amplify according to your preferences, but that involves opportunity costs that make it costly to get voting weight on a blockchain. And therefore, you need to invest resources in order to get a majority. And this implies that you are willing to support the system rather than destroy it. And so historically, the first approach to this was the so-called proof of work consensus mechanism. It is used, for example, in Bitcoin and a lot of the other early cryptocurrencies. And in proof of work, this scarce resource that needs to be verifiable in the blockchain system is computational power. So essentially, in order to get voting weight, you need to solve cryptographic puzzles. And if you have a stronger, more expensive computer and you invest more electricity, then you will get more voting weight. Now, ultimately, because you need to buy this hardware and you need to buy this electricity, this means that voting power is somewhat coupled to capital. And as I will show in a minute, this process is highly electricity intensive, and this is why alternatives, for example, proof of stake, have been deployed. And they do this coupling between voting weight and capital directly. So they leave out this maybe unnecessary step that is electricity intensive. Why is proof of work so electricity intensive? The reason is that the participants in the system somewhat need to be incentivized to play with the game, basically, to invest computational power. There must be some incentive to have a strong voting weight. And the incentive with Bitcoin and a lot of other cryptocurrency, namely all those that use proof of work, is that whenever you vote and you found a solution to this cryptographic puzzle, you get a reward. You get a certain number of new crypto coins that are generated out of thin air. So for example, in Bitcoin in 2009, you received 50 new coins for every new block. And on average, there is a new block every 10 minutes. So in 2009, the price of Bitcoin was still very, very low. So it was a fraction of a cent. This means that every block, the value of the new coins that was generated was only a few cents. And since this happens every minute, every hour, you can observe a value of less than $1 of incentives being distributed to the miners who found new blocks. So if you compute this, so for a couple of cents or $1, you cannot buy a lot of electricity. You can buy a couple of kilowatt hours. And so if you do the math, that means that the power consumption of the consensus mechanism is also a few kilowatts. So corresponding to 2 or 3 or 4 water cookers or hair dryers. So that's not a lot. The problem, for some people it was a good thing, for electricity consumption a bad thing, is that the price of Bitcoin went up enormously since 2009. So the price increased by a factor of more than 20 million. And today, so we have prices of more than $20,000. And the number of new coins that is being generated in every new block is still at 6.25. So it is being halved every 4 years. So that means that the electricity consumption has also gone up enormously, because there are a lot of incentives to invest in computational power. And so all this money is essentially being spent on electricity. And so today we have a power consumption of Bitcoin of around 20 gigawatts. So this corresponds to 20 nuclear reactors, the persistent output of that. And so we see that this corresponds to the electricity consumption of medium-sized countries, and this is arguably much more than a herd of computers that is running some collective blockchain or cryptocurrency should need. So what do we learn from this? So first thing, proof of work cryptocurrencies consume a lot of electricity. But this electricity consumption is not directly related to transaction processing, for example, how many payments the system needs to manage. It is also not associated with the efficiency of mining hardware, so how well we build computers. So this did not appear in this computation that just takes into account economic equilibrium. So we should learn that we cannot reduce the electricity consumption of, for example, Bitcoin by keeping the number of transactions that it handles small, or by keeping the length of the chain small, or by keeping the number of participants that use the system small. The energy consumption of proof of work cryptocurrencies is only depending on the price of the cryptocurrency and of the price of electricity. So if electricity is expensive, cryptocurrencies will consume less electricity. If the cryptocurrency is expensive, the cryptocurrency will also consume more electricity. So keep this in mind, reducing the number of transactions does not really help to solve the problem. Maybe it does because you keep functionality small and this has implications on the price, but it is not the best leverage to control the electricity consumption. You could also, for example, say, okay, instead of having a new block every 10 minutes, let's make it every 20 minutes, but this makes the functionality worse. And it also decreases the security of the system, because the security is given by the large amount of money being spent for electricity and hardware. And so in a minute, Moritz will show you what better approaches to reducing the electricity consumption could be. But just to show you that there is a lot of potential to reduce electricity consumption, I just wanted to give you a small chart that shows you how much smaller the electricity consumption of proof of stake blockchains is compared to proof of work cryptocurrencies. So it's, if you don't use the energy intensive proof of work consensus mechanism, you can reduce electricity consumption by around 99.99%. And for example, this has recently happened with the Ethereum blockchain in last September. So it previously ran on proof of work and consumed around as much electricity as Bitcoin. And now after moving to proof of stake, we see that the electricity consumption is much, much smaller and basically not even noticeable anymore. And with that, I hand over to Moritz.
Great. Thank you, Johannes. Really appreciate that. I think this is going to be quite relevant background for the next session, or the next section of this talk, I should say. What I want to look at now is how regulators have tried to address this phenomenon and how it hasn't quite worked. And then in the end, also offer some potential new avenues of how to address the cryptocurrency energy consumption problems. So I want to start off by giving a very brief case study around cryptocurrency mining in China. As of relatively recent, China still had the lion's share of hash rate for Bitcoin mining. You can see on this graph here that as recent as Q4 2019, this was around 80%. But we've seen increased anti-cryptocurrency regulatory measures by the Chinese government starting in 2019. So this was the point in time where the Chinese government termed Bitcoin an undesirable technology, which is a term that is sort of reserved for technologies that are supposed to be phased out and are no longer desirable by the Chinese government. The Bank of China, when rolling out this new guidance, cited environmental concerns for this step, even though it's disputed whether these are actually the underlying reasons. So we can see that this ban had an effect on the hash rate. If we look at the different regions that provide hash rate capacity to Bitcoin. So going back to what Johannes was explaining there, those countries that run the computers that participate in proof of work, we can see that following these regulatory interventions, some of the hash rate capacity in fact moved away from China into neighboring countries, but also into the US. But notably, the overall hash rate and therefore the total electricity consumption of Bitcoin was not impacted by that. We can also see, and this is not shown in this diagram, that investors continue to be active on the cryptocurrency market. So if we're looking at it from a consumer perspective, these regulatory interventions didn't have any noticeable effect on how blockchain was handled within China, even though some of the miners moved their operations into different regions. This is one example that shows how difficult it is to move customers away from engaging in cryptocurrency. I want to follow up with another case study that's similar to that, and this is around cryptocurrency adoption in Nigeria. So Nigeria is known as the crypto capital of the world, has one of the highest crypto usership rates worldwide, and this is mostly due to a difficult macroeconomic climate and international transfers that have become very costly as a result of these sort of macroeconomic challenges. The Central Bank of Nigeria undertook 2 stages of regulatory interventions around Bitcoin. One was against banks facilitating cryptocurrency transactions. For example, those banks that were funding centralized exchanges. Another more aggressive ban in 2021 saw customer accounts being closed for those customers that engaged with central cryptocurrency exchanges, for example. But despite this, in Nigeria, the cryptocurrency usership remains at a record high. And I wanted to give the Chinese example and the Nigerian example to show that central interventions against miners are really rarely successful, and that it's very easy to evade decentralized regulations from a consumer perspective because cryptocurrencies cannot be regulated locally effectively. So adding to this, we wanted to look a little bit deeper into the motivations for using cryptocurrencies and found really 2 fundamentally different ones worldwide. We can see in the global north that cryptocurrencies are mostly speculation objects used by young, higher income individuals that use it essentially as a very volatile investment, whereas in countries of the global south, they are actually used to replace in parts an outdated traditional banking sector and are used in earnest as a means of payment. So we see these very different ways of applying cryptocurrencies. We wanted to look more deeply into this effect, specifically around the use of cryptocurrencies as a means of payment, and conducted a user study in Nigeria where we gathered data from 158 Nigerian cryptocurrency users that had a very typical demographic profile, young males mostly, with varying expertise and relatively even transaction volume in the past on Bitcoin. We were interested, before the backdrop of what Johannes has described, in the environmental properties of Bitcoin and how the Bitcoin users perceive these environmental properties and environmental challenges. So what we did is we asked these users around their opinions on Bitcoin electricity consumption and later also on their perspective on who should address it. So initially, to just establish whether there was a strong concern around the effects of electricity consumption and global warming, we asked our participants a few questions around the potential challenges around climate change on their individual living environment. And we found quite a great concern around that, with the mode of responses being extremely concerned for all of the potential effects. We see some smaller differences, but overall a very high degree of environmental consciousness in the participants. Next, to understand better what these self-declared expert Bitcoin users knew about the electricity consumption of Bitcoins, we asked them a few questions around their perception of energy consumption. So we started off by asking them what they believed the actual electricity consumption of Bitcoin was. And we didn't reveal the figures here, the watt hours, the physical figures, and we didn't reveal the actual consumption, but we provided these 6 options here to the users to just judge how close they were to the real electricity consumption figure. As a result, we saw that the participants systematically underestimated the energy consumption. So we can see on the left-hand side, everything in the lighter color here are options that were under the correct estimate. On the right-hand side, we see the overestimation bucket. So we can see that this is clearly skewed on the left-hand side. So very similar to what Johannes has described, we're looking into a user base that doesn't really have a good understanding of how high the contemporary electricity consumption of Bitcoin really is. So most of the users think it's somewhere around the sort of, single-digit terawatt hours mark, whereas in reality it is a factor 24 higher, right? So there is a quite significant difference here. To follow up on this, we also asked them whether they thought that something should be done against the electricity consumption. And those that answered this question with yes were mostly found that private sector actors were responsible. So in this case, Bitcoin miners, Bitcoin users, and Bitcoin developers. And only at second place saw intergovernmental organizations and the legislature. So the big question is, like, what is the question that we can learn from that, and how can we derive any policy recommendations from these findings? So we believe that to address the problem of cryptocurrency, electricity consumption, consumer education is key, really. So we've seen that preventive measures don't really have a good track record due to the international nature. So we see in the Chinese example that it's quite straightforward for miners to relocate to other regions. And we see that there is quite a significant gap in knowledge on the consumer side. One idea that we looked into was the potential of energy labeling for cryptocurrencies. We know that most users use centralized exchanges to obtain cryptocurrency. And these are regulated entities that can be targeted by regulatory interventions. And these normally look a little bit like what you see here on the screen. They show the details of the assets obtainable, their price, but not much more information around that. One suggestion that we're looking into right now is to provide energy labels that can help users make more sustainable choices. So in this example, we take some inspiration from the European energy labeling initiatives and assign an energy score to various cryptocurrencies that shows fairly easily what cryptocurrencies are more energy friendly. In this case, Ethereum, as Johannes has touched on, after the merge, and Hedera, which is a permissioned blockchain. So what we really want to leave you with from this talk is the thought of focusing on consumer education instead of centralized regulation targeting miners. And this is our slot done, and I guess we can move on to the questions from here.
All right, we're going to open the floor for questions, and I'm going to check to see if any questions have been put into the Q&A area.
If there are no questions, I have a question for my colleagues, co-presenters.
Okay, Mr. Alibasic, you can ask the question.
It's Dr. Alibasic. So I have a question. Recently, I spent a month in Kosovo in Southeast Europe, and I work with the Prime Minister's office and their national development strategy and national energy strategies. And one of the issues that kept coming up is the intensive use of energy in areas of Kosovo where there's a lot of cryptocurrency mining. So I was just curious if in your research you come across these countries in Europe that may have seen an increase in energy use in cryptocurrency mining. And if you have studied Kosovo, for example, it came as a surprise to me that a lot of energy use does come from those.
Yeah, great question. I can just start to try to provide an answer to that, and then I think Johannes probably has some thoughts on that as well. I think what we've seen, at least in the Chinese example, is really that miners will most likely follow the best value for money they can get, and will follow the cheapest electricity prices, coupled with the regulatory environment. So if you're seeing an uptake in electricity consumption due to cryptocurrency mining in Kosovo, this is probably one of the reasons for it, that there's a good pricing structure for miners.
Thank you.
So I wasn't aware about the issue in Kosovo, but I know that there are other countries like Syria where similar things have happened. So my suggestion would be to just make electricity a little bit more costly, because then it wouldn't be attractive for miners anymore, and the problem would disappear. So typically electricity is subsidized there, and yeah, but on the other hand, you need to support the other inhabitants, so it's a bit difficult.
It is. It is. You have to target specific areas, but thank you for your answer. That's really good. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question here in the Q&A area. Has there been any research into feasibility methods to dissuade users from engaging in Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, great question. I'm not aware of any research that targets miners, particularly, I think, because these are normally sort of commercial organizations, in the sense that they have to have some investments into mining hardware as well, and so on. So we probably wouldn't foresee that consumer education would work on this type of user. But no, I'm not aware of any research.
So currently, regulators are mainly focusing on, for example, banks and other payment service providers, and try to make it less attractive for them to offer basically crypto-related services to users. So they have suggested different penalties, like, for example, increasing the risk that they associate with this crypto asset, although maybe it's more related to electricity consumption than the actual risk. And in this way, basically to convince consumers that they should invest in other assets. But I'm also not aware of, for example, Moritz suggested that electricity labeling could be one way to motivate consumers not to use those cryptocurrencies that live on an energy-intensive blockchain. But I'm also not aware of any studies how effective this would be.
Okay, I have another question here for Dr. Harris. There are democracies in the world where citizens are energy policy supportive, and their extreme engagement is also called negative citizenry. How do you suggest policies be handled by governments then?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, you're suggesting that there are those who engage in other countries and they may be defined as negative engaged. The idea is really to provide for engagement. I am 100% in favor of engaging public, engaging citizenry on all policy issues. What I find concerning is when minority vocal opposition, in many instances, in cases of renewable energy project development in the United States, have been successful in thwarting and canceling viable projects where the policy alternatives would have been to engage wider public that would benefit from these, and oftentimes would find those opposition groups were formed outside the community areas. There's actual a group called Stop These Things that whole entire goal is to prevent development of renewable energy projects in the United States. And there are templates used to develop Facebook opposition pages and such. So I believe that public, community, citizen engagement is a positive and collaborative, and where it provides opportunities for voices to be heard, and regardless of country, regardless of the political system. It is a necessity for successful implementation of policies. However, I often found in my research that minority vocal opposition can prevail over the benefits for the society and the community at large in influencing policy decisions at levels unseen before. I think it has to do with the effectiveness of social media and negative perceptions that elected officials have of anything that goes against the traditional view of policymaking. So I think it's a great question. I thank whoever asked for that question. Thank you so much.
Okay, any questions on the floor? No.
Just a quick one. It looked like there was touched upon one of the slides, but is there one type of cryptocurrency that's more energy intensive than any of the others?
So half a year ago, I would have said no, because at that time, Bitcoin and Ethereum were both relatively similar in energy consumption. Now Ethereum has transitioned from proof of work to proof of stake. So today its energy consumption is basically negligible. So only Bitcoin is remaining as a cryptocurrency with a huge electricity consumption. There are a few other smaller cryptocurrencies that still have a noticeable energy consumption. So for example, Bitcoin SV, Bitcoin Cash, so the early Bitcoin forks, and also versions that were forked of Ethereum that are still using proof of work, but they should be already an order of magnitude less than Bitcoin because the value of the cryptocurrency is much smaller. So you can always get a thumb estimate for the electricity consumption of a proof of work cryptocurrency by looking what is the value of the new tokens that are generated. And typically the block times and the number of coins per block is relatively similar across these proof of work cryptocurrencies. So it's basically the coin price that is decisive. And if a coin price of a proof of work cryptocurrency goes up enormously, then also the electricity consumption will go up by the same factor. And so maybe as a rule, if you want to have a sustainable cryptocurrency that stays sustainable, even if there is an increase in prices in the future, don't choose a proof of work cryptocurrency, choose a proof of stake cryptocurrency, and you don't need to be concerned.
All right. Okay, I have another question here for Dr. Ali Bassick. Do you look at time series analysis? If so, is renewable oppositions decreasing?
I have not used the specific research methods suggested or the analysis. Therefore, I'm not sure it would define those results as such, but I do see an increased opposition to renewables rather than decreased. By increased, I don't mean the majority of population is opposed to renewables. As a matter of fact, many studies have pointed that majority of the US population is in support and in favor of renewables. However, there are more vocal oppositions to the renewable energy projects development in areas where there haven't been before. But great question. Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, that brings us to, okay, hold on.
I'm not sure who this would be for, but back on Bitcoin mining, has anybody extrapolated how much energy is going to be required to extend Bitcoin to a global economy?
So the Nature paper from 2018 that I cited in the beginning did that, but they did that on a wrong assumption. They thought that basically by, for example, doubling the number of transactions that the network handles, you would also double the electricity consumption, and this is wrong. So the electricity consumption basically does not depend on the number of transactions that the network handles. It only depends on the coin price. And since Bitcoin is today typically being used not as a medium of exchange, so for its utility as a payment, but rather as an investment, you can't really say by how much the price would go up if more people would use it as a means of payment. So it's very difficult to interpolate it. But there are relatively clear bounds on the electricity that is produced worldwide. And today, Bitcoin consumes around 0.1%. And so by the time that this value goes up by an order of magnitude, probably it would lead to increasing electricity prices. So we shouldn't expect that one day the Bitcoin network will consume 50% of the world's electricity, because there is a reasonable balance between the coin price and the electricity price. And what ultimately determines the electricity consumption of Bitcoin is basically the ratio of the coin price and the electricity price. So if electricity is very scarce at some stage, the value of the electricity consumption won't go up beyond any reasonable bound. And what comes on top of this is that every 4 years, the value of Bitcoin, of new coins emitted in a new block in Bitcoin is being halved. So basically, if Bitcoin price stays constant, and electricity prices stay constant, the electricity consumption of Bitcoin will even go down up to the point where the electricity is not being, the amount of money being spent on electricity is not equal to the value of the new coins being generated anymore, but only the transaction fees that are being paid for the utility of the payment system. And there, my expectation is we have so many alternative cryptocurrencies that make it easy to do an online transaction. Probably the transaction fees, the cumulative transaction fees won't get to that large of a level as the new coins being generated. So today, only around 2% of the money that miners get comes from transaction fees. The rest are the new coins that are being generated. So I wouldn't expect that much more money is being paid in terms of transaction fees than today, which means probably the electricity consumption wouldn't go up very much, even if Bitcoin is adopted more as a global payment system. On the other hand, we always need to say, well, so Bitcoin is not the only network that provides this opportunity. There is a lot of controversial discussions whether proof of work or proof of stake is more secure. There are, for both sides, there are good arguments, but the discussion is still open, in my opinion. So we always should ask the question, well, if we can get the same functionality and the same security from a proof of stake network, even if proof of work is maybe not threatening climate, it is still maybe a non-necessary waste of resources because we can get the same functionality with much less electricity, namely with a proof of stake blockchain.
Thank you. Last call for questions. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you to our speakers and to our attendees. We're going to wrap this session up.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.